So the supplies, just to kind of refresh everyone, the supplies that we need out of our kit today are going to be that bone folder, the awl, the embroidery floss, and the tapestry needle. We'll also need a pair of scissors today or a paper cutter, and then the paper that we're going to be using for the inside of our book. And so I'm going to be using different colored paper today, just so it's a little easier to see on camera. But you can use all the same paper if you want to use copy paper, notebook paper, sketchbook paper, or even like found paper like we did with our junk journals. You can use found paper as well. I'm also going to demo how to do a cover for this one. And so I'm going to use just a piece of cardstock as my cover today. The process that we're doing is the Coptic stitch binding. And so that doesn't really change whether you do a cover or not. So if you want to do a cover, I'll kind of walk through that. And if you don't want to do a cover, that's okay too. We can add it without the cover. You can add it to the book covers that we made last week. And I can talk about that too when we get there. All right, so the process we're doing today is probably the most technical out of all the processes that we've done. We're doing the Coptic stitch binding. One of the things that you'll notice in this handout is that there are no words on it. It's just the images. And it's because this one is a little more, like I said, a little more technical. So we're going to kind of walk through it slowly. There's space. So if you want to add in your own notes, of course, you're welcome to. And we're doing the video, so you can refer back to it as often as you need. One of the things that I want to mention is we can take our time with this today. Because this series is extending, we don't have to finish it all in this one setting. So we'll take our time with it today. So I'm going to set the illustrated instructions aside for just a second. I'm going to pull out my example here. So this is my example. It has a cover on it, and then I have my pages on the inside. But what you'll see here on the spine, this is the Coptic stitch binding, right? And you can see it's a little different from what we've done before. Here, you'll see that there are several little booklets of paper in there. When we did our punch junk journal punch stitch, you'll see, let me pull this out. This is the one that I did, and you can see it's only one little book in there, one folding of paper. And we did that with the punch stitch. But for this Coptic stitch, we're going to be doing multiple layers. And this is a pretty a nice way to make a bigger book. I think it's one of the more common bookbinding processes, or binding processes. And so we'll kind of go through that today. But I want to talk, before we get started, just about some terms really quickly. You'll notice in this one, I talked about how with that junk journal, we had one little booklet that we put inside. In this one, you'll see I have 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what these are called is signature. So I have 5 signatures in here, right? So that'll kind of help us keep terms separate. These are signatures, and this is the book, right? So I have 5 signatures that I'm working with here. The next word I want to talk about is, you'll see these 4 rows here. This is where that binding takes place, where we're doing that sewing, right? And so these are called stations. So I have 4 stations here, and this is where I'm punching the holes and threading that embroidery floss through, right? So you can do, the truth is you can do as many signatures as you want, or as few as you want. It doesn't have to be a certain number. I'm doing 5 just because, I don't know, that felt right. But you can definitely do more or less than that. And then for these stations here, I did 4, but you can definitely do more than 4. You can do 24, or you can do 7. You can do 4. It doesn't really matter the number you do, because the stitch is the same, right? And so for today, I'm just going to kind of copy this. I'm going to do 5 signatures and 4 stations, right? So I'm going to go ahead and set my book out of the way and pull in my paper. So if you are following along, definitely go ahead and pull your paper out too. I'm going to move this up a little bit. And so what we are going to do is kind of set up our paper and make our signatures. So like I said, I'm going to be doing 5 different colors today, just so it's a little easier to see on camera which one I'm working with. But feel free to use whatever type of paper you like. So for the size of my book today, I'm using construction paper, which is about 8.5 by 11-ish. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of cut them in half and then have fold the 2 together. So I'm going to take a paper cutter really quickly. And you can use some scissors if you like. I'm going to cut my construction paper in half. So I'm just going to do that right now. So if you have your paper with you, go ahead and cut it, get it ready. So I'm taking that construction paper, cutting it in half, and I'm going to stack it. And that's going to be the size of my book today, right? This size. And so feel free to do that. The truth is you can make it any size you like, as long as your paper allows it. And so I'm just really quickly going through and cutting my paper so it's all the same size. So I encourage you to go ahead and do that too. I'm cutting my paper in half and then stacking it. So each of these booklets that I'm doing, I'm using 5 pages. Okay. So just go ahead right now and cut those, cut your paper and get those signatures ready. All right. You can use, like I'm using, if you have a paper cutter, sometimes that's a little easier to use. Or if you have scissors, that's fine too. I'm doing 5 signatures in my book, just so it gives me a good sized book. But again, you can use 3 signatures if you want, or you can get adventurous and do like 8 signatures or 10 signatures, whichever. Whatever you feel more comfortable with is good. But I'm going to be starting with 5 signatures today. All right. Let me get my paper. So I have my paper kind of cut down. I cut my paper, my construction paper in half and then stacked it on top of each other. And so what I'm going to do now is fold them, right? I see in the chat, someone's asking how many pages are in a signature, and it can be however many you want. I am using 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. I was using 4 pages of construction paper that I cut in half, so I have 8 pages total. And I feel like that's a good one, especially like starting out, trying it for the first time. So I had 4 pages of construction paper that I cut in half, and I'm using that to make my signature. Good question. So I'm going to take my construction paper that I cut in half, and I'm just going to fold it over and crease it. This is where that bone folder can come in handy, because you can kind of crease those edges. If you don't have that bone folder, using the underside of a pair of scissors is helpful too, and just kind of crease those edges. So now we have 1 signature, right? And I'm just going to do that with all of my paper now. Take each section that I cut, fold it in half, and crease it. If you're doing something a little thicker, like construction paper is a little thicker than copy paper, so it needs a little extra help when it comes to that creasing part. So having that bone folder or the pair of scissors is really helpful. Just going through right now and just making that crease, folding those pages, creasing it down. And so we're making our signatures. Doing, like I said, I'm doing a total of 5 signatures today. Making sure those creases, those folds are creased. And again, it doesn't have to be a certain size. I just find that this size is a little easy to work with. Oh, I see. And someone is sharing that they used a credit card on its side to do the creasing too. And that's good. There are a lot of things that we can use. That was a great suggestion too. So if you don't have that bone folder, you can use a credit card or gift card to do the same thing. So I have my 5 signatures here. And like I said, I've got them in different colors. So hopefully it's a little easier to see on camera. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my cover here. Let's see. And I've got some cardstock that I'm going to use for my cover. Now, when we talked about covers last week, we did 2 different types. We did a 2-panel cover, and then we did a longer cover, a variation of that. And so for this one, I'm just going to do a 2-panel cover. Now, if you're not doing a cover for this, know that that's okay. The process for binding is exactly the same, whether you're using a cover or not. And we'll talk about that once I get started. But I have my 2 pieces of cardstock here. Let me pull this up a little bit. And so I'm just going to take one of my signatures and kind of measure those sides, right? And so you can see, hopefully you can see a little bit, that when I'm laying down my signature here on top of the cover, you can see I've gone in a little bit. So I have a little bit of a frame on the outside edges. And so I want that kind of all the way around. You'll see with my example here, if I open it up, you see that edge all the way around that piece. And that's what you want. I know sometimes it's nice to have them the exact same size, but I think it helps sometimes, gives us a little leeway when it's slightly smaller. The signature is slightly smaller than our cover paper. And so what I'm going to do is I've moved my signature in a little bit, so I have that frame. And I'm just going to make a mark so I can cut that paper out. And so I'm just going to go ahead and do that with my cover. So if you're doing a cover, go ahead and measure out a piece of, whether it's cardstock or cardboard or the covers from last week that we made from last week. Go ahead and measure out the size and give it a little trim. So you can see with my cover here that if I put the book in the middle, my little signature in the middle, you see I have a little bit of blue that's sticking out. All right. So let's go back to our signatures for just a second. You saw in my example here that we had 4 stations that we were working with. When we're doing this type of binding, we want to make sure that all those holes that we make in those stations line up. And so one of the things that I've done that helps me when it comes to poking those holes is I make a mark with like, let me move this down a little bit, make a mark with like a pencil or a pen, so I know where to put those holes, right? And know that whatever mark you make, whether you're doing a pen or pencil or even marker, that generally it's going to be covered up by the thread or embroidery floss that we use for the binding part, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 4 stations here. And so I'm just going to kind of like spread them out a little bit. You can do evenly spaced, or what I'm going to do today is kind of make marks all the way down with my pencil. And I'm going to do 2 that are kind of close together on one side. So you can see I have 2 marks here that touch all my signatures. And then I'm going to come to this other side and do the same thing. I'm going in about 1 inch for each mark that I'm making. And I'm just carrying that pencil mark all the way down and then going in about another inch. Know that it doesn't really matter where you put your signature or your station marks, right? It doesn't matter where you put them because the only thing that matters is that each of the marks on each of the signatures line up, right? So it can be uneven as long as each of those signatures have that same uneven marking, if that makes sense. Okay. So the next step that we do, and I'm going to use a permanent marker so it's a little easier to see, but that next step that we're going to do after we mark our signatures is we're going to mark, if you're using a book or a cover, we're going to mark that cover, right? And so I can see that my signatures on this, well, maybe it's a little easier to see with this lighter color. You can see those station marks are in pencil on my signature here. And so I'm just going to do the same placement on my cover. But what I'm going to do is come in just a little bit so I have that edge. Whereas with the signatures, we're poking the holes in the center. With the cover, we're going in just a little bit, right? And so I'm going to line my book, the ends of my pages up with the cover. So I have a bigger gap here on the side. And I'm just going to make little dots right where those signature marks are. I'm using the folded side to make those marks. On the folded side, when we were doing the signature marks, we did it on the folded side because that's where we're going to poke those holes through. And so that's the part that needs to be lined up. So when we lay it down on our cover, if you're doing the cover, you want the folded side, the side with the marks, on the edge of the paper so you can make those dots, line those dots up. All right, so we have our pieces. We have our cover, if you're doing the cover, and we have our signatures, and our signatures are marked, right? Those stations are marked. So what I'm going to do is poke those holes now. So I'll take my first signature and I'm going to open it up all the way through. So all my papers are lined up and you can see those dots on that first paper, right? So what I'm going to do is take that awl or anything else that's a little sharp point if you don't have the awl, and we're just going to poke those holes all the way through, right? And take your time with it. We want to make sure our papers are lined up, all the creases are lined up for that one signature, that first signature, and we're going to poke those holes through. Okay. So I'm just going to take my time with it. Again, let me come a little closer so you guys can see the marks. And I'm just poking that all through that first mark that I made, right? And so that's going all the way through, right? So it's lined up on that crease. I'm just holding my paper tightly. I'm just going to do that with each of those holes, right? Each of those marks, poke the hole so it goes all the way through. And then do it to all 4 of those marks. Sometimes it helps to poke it through and kind of wiggle it a little bit. So now we see I have all 4 of my holes, my stations. So after I put the holes in this signature, I'm going to fold it back up and set it aside. And I'm going to do that with each of my signatures, right? I'm going to open them up, make sure the creases are lined up, and then poke the holes in each one of those marks. And make sure it goes all the way through. Also, be careful with your fingers. I know there have been times that I have stabbed myself doing this. So definitely be careful when you're going through poking these holes. And just kind of poke them all the way through, right? We're making sure all 4 of those holes are poked. And we're going to do that with each one of our signatures. So we can see as we're poking those holes, you can see the holes, those stations are starting to line up. They're in the same spot, right? And so we'll just do that with each of our signatures. Let me get these out of the way. opening those signatures up and poking those holes all the way through. So that hole is right along that crease. And so you want to try and get it as much of the center as you can. So what I'm doing for mine today, I had 4 pieces of like this light blue construction paper, and I cut it in half. So that gave me 8 pages. So when I fold it, it's giving me 16. But what I started with was just 4 pages for this signature, 4 pieces of the light blue construction paper. So if you're doing 4 pieces, it just kind of doubles once you cut it and then fold it over on itself. So it'll give me a total of 16 pages, right? But it's only 4 original papers that I used for the signature. And so just as you're going through, make sure those signatures, those stations are lining up, right? And then just we'll go through and poke all those holes. So it's okay if they don't exactly line up. The truth is, this is our first book doing a binding this way. So it's okay for it to be a little wonky. So if it doesn't exactly line up, don't stress about it. Just kind of line it. You can see mine are not completely lined up. You can see they're kind of off a little bit, and that's okay. As we're doing that stitching, it'll kind of line it up a little bit for us. Yeah. And there is beauty in that imperfection, so it's okay for it. But just go through right now and poke those holes in each of those stations. You can do, I'm doing an even number today, but if you want to do like 5 stations, you can do 5 stations. If you want to do 17 stations, it can be odd or even. The process doesn't change based on the number of stations. So whichever you like to do. 4, I think, is a good start, and so that's what I'm doing today. But definitely, if you want to do an odd number, you can do that. I've seen people do 3 and 5, so whatever feels right is good, is okay. All right, so now that I've got my stations poked and my signatures, I'm going to go to my covers now, and I've got my front cover and my back cover, and I'm laying them on top of each other, and you can see I have those 4 holes or 4 marks, right, that line up with my book, right, my signatures. And so I'm just going to take my awl and poke it through those holes. You want to make sure your pages are lined up. You want them in the same position. And so I'm just going to very carefully poke that hole all the way through. Now with the signatures, we did it on that crease, right, on the fold, but with the covers, we're going inside just a little bit because we're doing 2 panels. So if you were doing a cover, a front and back cover, just kind of make that mark slightly inside that edge, right? Poking those holes all the way through. So now both my covers have the holes in them. And if I go to line up my signatures, you can see the holes in that cover line up with the stations in my book, right? So you can see everything is lined up. Okay. So now we come to the binding part. So if we look at our illustrated instructions, you can see how I've laid out my image here. I have my cover on the bottom, and then I have those signatures stacked up. If you are not doing a cover, that's okay. Your bottom signature will act like the cover when we're doing that binding part. And so you can see with that first hole in the first station, there are 4 movements that we do. Okay? And so I'm going to start with a cover here, and my first signature. And so if you're following along with me, go ahead and pull out some of that embroidery floss. And I'm going to pull out about a yard to work with. So I'm just kind of stretching my arms out and doing that length. It's okay if you don't have enough embroidery floss to do the whole thing. I'll show how to kind of tie a knot and add another length of the embroidery floss too. And so I'm just going to take that embroidery floss. I cut off about a yard. I'm just going to thread my tapestry needle with it. And so this is where that tricky part starts, getting started. So I'm just going to go through and kind of round out my holes, stick my awl in those holes again, just to make sure everything is lined up. And I have my cover page, right? So what we're going to do to start this first stitch is I'm going to start with my first signature. So if you are doing a cover, you have your cover and your signature. And if you are not doing a cover, you have both signatures, right? So for the purpose of this, I'm going to call my cover the bottom and my signature the top. And so what I'm going to start with, whether you're doing 2 signatures or a cover and a signature, is I'm going to start with that top one. And so you can see I have my booklet is opened all the way through, and I'm going to start from the inside and poke the needle through that first hole, right? And so whether you're doing the 2 signatures or the signature and the cover, we're going to start with that top one and poke that tapestry needle through that first hole. We're going to pull it almost all the way through. We're going to leave a little tail, and that tail is going to kind of hang there until we get to the end. But we're going to put that tail kind of on the inside. So taking that top signature, poke that hole through that first hole, took the embroidery floss through the first hole. All right, so I've gone through my top signature, right? So mine is about, I'm going to leave it about 4 inches or 5 inches. It doesn't have to be super long because when we're done putting all our signatures together, we're going to tie this off. So we want it to be long enough that we can tie it, but it doesn't have to be too long. So mine is about 4 inches. My tail is 4 inches. So it doesn't have to be super long. All right, so we have that tail. We put that embroidery floss through that first hole of our top signature. And so now take that bottom signature or the cover, and you can see I have mine kind of lined up. This is the bottom, right? So I'm going to take my needle. I went through that first hole. Now I'm going to go through the first hole of my cover, right? So when I pull that embroidery floss through, So when you pull the embroidery floss out, you have a single like strand of it that has several strands inside that make up that one thick cording. And so we're not undoing those strands. We're going to use it just the way it is. With mine here, it's got the several pieces inside of it. I'm going to leave it together like that. So I'm not doubling over that embroidery floss. I'm just using that simple, just the way it came from the skein. So you can see with my signature here, I threaded it through that top signature, right? And then thread it through my cover, right? So if you were doing a bottom like a signature instead of a cover, you're just doing that same thing, right? So threading it through. So now that floss, that embroidery floss is kind of coming out the bottom. That next step that we're going to do is to go around that bottom one, right? So I went through that bottom one the first time. My next step, my needle is on the bottom. My next step is to go around that bottom one, right? Again, so I'm making a loop. I'm going through that exact same hole. So when I threaded it through the first time, I went from the top to the bottom and pulled it through. And now I'm going to go do that same thing. I'm going to go from the top through to the bottom. So I'm making a little loop, right? So when I pull that through, you'll see there's a little loop that's showing, right? And that's what we want to see. So just to recap, we went through the inside of that top signature to the outside of the top signature. We went through the top of that cover to the bottom of the cover. And then we looped that needle around and went through the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover again, right? Through that hole. And I'm going to pull that. So I'm going to pull that again. I'm going to pull mine out so I can show. Okay. So I am doing the signature and the cover. Take my embroidery floss and I'm going to go inside that signature and poke that needle through that first hole. Okay. And I'm going to pull it through almost all the way. I'm going to leave a little tail. So I went from the inside to the outside. And then I'm going to go to my cover, or if you are using another signature instead of a cover, you'll go from that inside to the outside, right? So we're kind of threading it straight through, right? So we went from the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover. And then we're going to take our needle and do that same motion. I'm going to take the needle. We came out through the bottom. And so I'm going to go around to the top and go through the bottom to the bottom again. So we're basically making that same movement, going from the top to the bottom. Whoop. Got a little bit of a knot. Oh no. I feel like every time I work with embroidery floss, I am dealing with a knot. I don't know of an easy way. I feel like every time, there we go. Every time I'm getting those tangles. So just to recap our first step, I'm taking that signature and my cover, right? And I'm taking my needle and pulling it from the inside of that signature. Well, got my book mixed up. Pulling it from the inside of the signature to the outside of the signature, right? So going through that hole, that first hole, right? And pulling it through. Not pulling it all the way through, so we have a tail. And then I'm going to take it and just continue that movement. Go from that signature to my cover, right? And I'm going to go from the top of the cover through that hole to the bottom of the cover and just pull that through. So that was that second step, right? Going through the signature from the inside to the outside, and then going through the cover from the top of the hole to the bottom of the hole. So my third step is taking that needle again, and I'm going to go, instead of going back through the bottom, going up, I'm going to go through the top again, right? Do that same motion. I went from the top to the bottom, and I'm going to go again from the top to the bottom. And so what this is doing is creating that little bit of a loop here. And so when I pull it, you can see it kind of loops around the edge, right? And that's what we want. That's what we want to see. So after we've done that, we took our thread, we went from the inside of the signature to the outside of the signature, and then we went through the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover. And then we went back through from the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover. So now our needle is at the bottom, right? You want to pull it a little bit, so it's kind of snug, but it doesn't have to be super tight right now, right? All right, so now that we have that step, we've made that loop, our needle is on the bottom again. What we're going to do, our last step for this signature, or for this station, is to take the needle and go from that signature, go from the outside of the signature to the inside, right? So we started going from the inside of the signature to the outside, and we're going to end going from the outside of the signature to the inside, right? So we started going from the inside of the signature to the outside, from the top of the cover to the bottom, and then from the top of the cover to the bottom again. And then we're going to take that tapestry needle and go back through that same hole in the signature, the same hole we started, and pull it through. Okay. And like I said, this is that starting point. It can be feel a little tricky, but it gets easier the further along we go. It's this top part that's just a little tricky. And so you want to kind of pull it a little tight. We don't want it super tight, but we want to make sure that that cover is right against that signature. So our next step is to go to this next hole, right? So I'm going to go to the inside of that signature, and you can see my tail and my needle are on the same side, right? Both on the inside. I'm going to take my needle and go through that second station, right? That second hole. So when I pull it through, we have that thread edge right along that crease. I think that's the trickiest part of bookbinding, is keeping an eye on that tail, keeping that thread untangled. So once we go through that second station, right, that second hole, we go from the inside to the outside of the signature. We're going to do that same movement with that cover. Take that needle and go from the top of the cover to the bottom and pull it through. So we're kind of repeating what we did with that first one, pulling it through. We went from the inside of the signature to the outside of the signature. Then we went from the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover. And we're going to loop around and do the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover again. So it's making that loop. Right? And you'll pull it somewhat tight. We're wanting those holes to be lined up. I will say this is our first time making the book, so it may be a little loose. It may feel a little loose, and that's okay. The more we do it, the tighter we'll be able to hold on to it. So after I started this by going from the inside of my signature to the outside, And then I went from the top of my cover through to the bottom, and then went around from the top of my cover to the bottom again. And I'm going to finish by taking my needle and sticking it back through that hole in my signature and pulling it all the way through. So we're repeating that step. And as I pull it through, I can pull it a little tighter so they're next to each other. Okay. And then I'll continue that on all the way through my book. So I'll go to the inside. You'll see my needle and my tail are on the same side again. Okay. And so I'm going to take my needle and go through that third station all the way through. And so what we're doing is repeating that all the way down. Okay. And so take your time with it. And we're just kind of repeating that all the way down. And so from the inside, you see my tail and my needle are on the same side. I'm just going to go through that third one and go all the way down. And just repeat that. Pulling that through, and you can see as I'm pulling it through, those inside cords are lining up right along that crease, right? My tail is still there. And I'm going to repeat that same process. I went from the inside of my signature to the outside, right? And then I'm going to do the top of my cover to the bottom and pull that through. And just kind of checking in with that, pulling it through, and then going from the top of the cover to the bottom again. Doing that twice, looping that around, and then going back through that hole in the signature to the inside. But when you get to that last row, that last station, there's just a little difference in how we kind of finish that one off, right? And so I'm going to take that needle, I'm going to go through that last hole in my station, my last station, go from the inside of my signature to the outside. That's the same. Pull it a little tight, right? So inside of signature to the outside of signature. And then from the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover, just the same. Then go back through the top of the cover to the bottom of the cover. And then because I'm at the end, I'm not going to go back through that same hole, right? So what's different is I'm going to take my next signature, right? And instead of going back through that first signature's hole, I'm going to go back through that second signature hole and pull that through. So you can, hopefully you can see a little bit what I did. Instead of doing that last step of threading that needle through that first signature, I'm threading it through that second signature. And that's how I start that second row. So once we have that, I'm going to go ahead, I've threaded it through that first one. So I'm going to go ahead and thread it through that second signature and pull it all the way through. Just kind of pull it a little snugly. So once we go through that station, on the first signature, we went through the cover, but for this second signature, we're going to go around that embroidery floss. We're not going to go through that cover. We're going to go around that embroidery floss loop that's there. Okay, can everyone see that? So instead of sticking it through, I'm just going to loop it around. So I'm going to stick it in between that first signature and the cover, stick that needle there. So my needle is coming through. And then I'm going to stick it back through on the other side of that loop, right? Once I go through that signature, let me see if I can put, there we go. Once I go through that signature here, from the inside to the outside of that signature, hopefully you can see it just a little bit. I've looped it around that first loop and pulled it through. So I stuck it in between my needle. I stuck between the cover and the first signature and pulled it through. And then once I was on the inside, I stuck my needle through on the other side of that stitch, other side of that station, pulled it through. So there's that little loop that's coming through. And then just pulling that tightly. And then sticking it through that first hole, or that same hole. Okay. So I'm gonna pull this through and demo that one more time. The great thing about this type of binding is that we're not doing any knots, we're not tying anything. So it's really easy to pull. If you find that you missed a step, it's really easy to just pull that thread through and not, and kind of redo it. Okay? So let's kind of attach that signature. And it takes a minute to get used to finding the right way to hold this whole packet in your hand as we're doing it. Just to repeat that first step of today, after we connect that second signature, right? We connect that second signature. We're going to go through that second station, that hole in the second station. Okay? So I'm just going to pull it through that second hole. Okay? Let me come down a little closer so it's a little easier. I'm pulling it through that second hole, that second station. And instead of going through that cover, I'm just going to loop around that embroidery floss, right? So I'm not going through any hole. Once I come through that signature, I'm just looping around that embroidery floss that's there. Through that embroidery floss and pulling that through. So we're not attaching this signature to the cover, right? We're just pulling it through that embroidery floss loop, right? And after we do that, we'll go back through that same hole in that signature. Go under. And then go back through that signature. And you want to make sure you're going all the way through to the center of that signature, the center crease of that signature. Okay. And so that's what we're going to kind of continue on with this next one. Once you pull it back through that signature, I'm going to go to the next station and go all the way through that hole. Okay. Pull it through. And so what you'll notice, just like with the last time, you're starting to build that center line in the crease. It's sewing together those pages. And so I come through that signature, come through that station. And again, instead of going through anything, we're just looping it around that embroidery floss, going under that embroidery floss. Yeah, and pulling it through. And it may take a minute, again, to get the feel of it. And you want to make sure you're kind of pulling tightly, not super tight, but somewhat tightly on the embroidery floss so you get those signatures kind of close together. I will say, I know I don't have a lot of strength in my hand. So sometimes pulling the embroidery floss is a little hard on my hand. So I just pull it as tight as I can. If you are using just a regular piece of cardstock like I am, those holes will kind of wear when there's a lot of stress on them. I haven't had any issues once I'm done with the binding part, like at the end. I haven't had any issues with those holes tearing as I'm using it. The part that puts a lot of stress on it is the actual binding part, what we're doing right now. So there are a couple ways around that. One way is to put these holes in our cover further down, which is like one option. The other option is to do, in our second session, we talked about covers. And one of the covers we did was the cardboard cover with paper or fabric that was the two separate panels. You can do that as our outside cover, and it's a little stronger and holds up a little better. Or holds up better. So that's like one way to kind of go through the whole part. All right, so once we loop through, go under that loop, embroidery loop, we're gonna go back through that station's hole, right? And we're gonna go just all the way through the hole we just went through. We'll go back through. And then we'll come to that last station, that last hole. Yeah. Oh, I see in the chat someone said they used washi tape on the edge to strengthen the cardstock, and that's such a great option. Doing something like that, a piece of tape, like packing tape or painter's tape will work as well to kind of strengthen that. Yeah, good suggestion, great suggestion. So we're just going to kind of continue on. We'll go to that fourth station and send that needle all the way through. And just like in the others, we're not going through the cover. We're going to go around underneath that last embroidery floss loop. At the end, just like what we did on that first signature, when we get to the end second signature, instead of going through that loop, we're going to connect our next signature. Right? So I'm going to bring my next signature in. All right. So now that we're bringing those signatures in, we're starting to build up our book. Instead of going back through that second signature, we're going to go into our third signature. Now, one little trick, now that we've looped around that first embroidery stitch between that first signature and the cover, we're going to come back through in between the loop from the first and second signature, right? So when we were stitching on this last station, we came through the signature, looped under, went under the embroidery stitch from that first signature and the cover. And then to come back up to connect this one, we're going to go under that stitch we just did. Okay, I'm gonna redo this one so we can see it close up. Okay, I know that this part is a little tricky, especially when we're learning it for the first time. It can feel a little tricky, but I promise that the more we do it, the more confident we'll feel in that, in those stitches, right? So going back, we're on our second signature, our last station. We're going to stick our needle through that last station all the way through and pull that through. Okay. We're going to go under the embroidery floss between that first station and the cover. We're going to go underneath that embroidery floss. Right. Pull that through. And then to add our next signature, our third signature, I'm going to take my tapestry needle. You can see this stitch between the first and second signature. I'm going to go under that stitch. Now, instead of going into that hole again in that last station, I'm going to add my next signature. Right? So I'm just going to take my needle, my tapestry needle, and thread it through that first station hole. You may find some shifting happen. I just found I had some shifting in my signature. So after we loop that around, we're going to take that needle and thread it through the third signature. Thread it all the way through. So that's our first stitch. Okay. We've added our third signature, our third little booklet, gone through that first hole, that first station. So now I'm going to go through that second station. So I'm going to take the needle and just thread it through that hole from the inside to the outside. And pull it all the way through. Okay. So I've come through that second station, the hole in the second station. And just like we did before, instead of going through that cover, I'm going to go under that stitch, right? Under the stitch from the first and second station. Okay. I'm on my third signature. I came through the hole from the inside to the outside. And I'm going to take my tapestry needle and go under that stitch between the first and second, right? So we're stitching those two signatures together. Okay? So I'll go through that loop, under that loop. And then come back through that hole. So it's just repeating basically that same stitch. We're going through the station hole, wrapping around, wrapping under the embroidery floss, and then going back through the hole. So it's that basic step each time. On the ends, we have a slight variation, but it's still coming through the hole, going around underneath that previous stitch, and then going back through the hole. Okay. And so then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go to that third station and go all the way through. I see a question about thread. If you run out of thread, no worries. I usually run out of thread when I'm doing this too. Let's go ahead and chat just a little bit about how to add new thread. So other people may be in that same position. So if you're running out of thread, you want to make sure the tail, the last little bit of thread that you have, is inside a signature, not on the outside. You want to make sure it's kind of like this. We have that thread on the inside. So what we'll do is we'll take a new piece of embroidery floss, is what we're using today, and we'll knot it together in between those stations. Now, typically with bookbinding, you're using like a cotton thread that's covered in wax, like beeswax. And so one of the benefits of using that wax is that it's a little easier to knot. You may have some little difficulty knotting the embroidery floss in between the stations. I know I do. You may be better at it than I am, actually. But we're just knotting those two tails of the embroidery floss together in between a station. And it doesn't matter which station it is, but you want to make sure that it's inside your signature, not on the outside. You're just kind of knotting it together on the inside. Yes. So in the chat, there's a question about just kind of the process, and you're exactly right. When we're doing that first station or first signature, we're looping it through just that cover. When we add that second signature, we're looping it through the station before, right? So we're going between the first and the cover. When we're doing the third signature, we're looping it between the stitches between the first and second signature. So that's exactly right. Yeah, and we're just going to kind of add that as we go along. Yeah. So let's continue on. Again, like tying it off, when you're running out of the embroidery floss, you're just tying a new one, tying just a little knot of a new one on the inside of a signature. And we're doing that because it kind of hides it a little bit. If it were on the outside, if we're changing thread on the outside, you'll see those knots start to show up. And so that's why we like to do it on the inside, because it kind of hides it a little bit, which is nice. So we'll just continue on. We came back through our second station. So we're going to go through our third one, going all the way through. Okay, that third station coming all the way through. And we're on our third signature now. So we're going to take our tapestry needle and thread it under the embroidery loop, the embroidery floss, in between the first and second. So we're going just from that loop, from that row before. Okay. Threading it through and pulling it. Once we go under, we stitch it together. Once we go under it, we're going to go back through that station's hole. Okay. And we're just kind of building it, layering and layering. I know it may feel a little tricky right now, but I promise the more we do it, the more confident you'll feel in that stitch. I know that was true for myself as well. Like I was very unsteady when I was learning this process, but the more I practiced it, the more I played around with it, the more it kind of made sense to me, and I felt more confident in my stitching. But we're coming through. Going back to our signature, we came through that third station. So we're going to go through that last station, that fourth station, going from the inside to the outside, right? And this is where that stitch varies a little bit when we're doing that end. So you can see I came to the outside of that signature. I'm going to take my tapestry needle and go under the stitch from the row before, right? From the second and third, or second and first, going under that and pulling that through. So it's looping around. But instead of going back in to that last one, that last hole, I'm going to go under the stitch I just made. Go under that stitch and connect my next signature. So I'm going to bring my next signature in. So the end, again, the end is where that varies just a little bit. So we'll go again. To add that next signature, I'm going to send it through from the outside to the inside, going through that first station, all the way through. And that connects my fourth signature. Okay. So we're just kind of pulling that through. And you can see those stitches are building, right? The stitches that we're making are building, adding on those signatures. So once I come in that first station, that hole in the first station, I'm on the inside now. So I'm going to take my needle and just go through that second side, go from the inside to the outside of that signature. Pull it all the way through. And just like we did the row before, the signature before, I'm going to loop my embroidery floss, loop my needle through the embroidery floss stitch from that row before. So I'm going to go through the stitch that's in between the second and third signature, right? I'm on the fourth one, so I'm going under the stitch from the row before, right? And just kind of threading that through. So it's making that little loop, right? And then I'm going to go back through that second station hole. Now, this process, it isn't a fast process. This one, like many of the projects we do, are very slow moving, and it's okay to take your time with it. So we're coming through that second stitch or that second station. Take that needle through the third one. I'm just gonna repeat my step here. So I'm gonna pull my floss out. And again, that's one of the nice things about not tying, knotting things off, is that because we're stitching it, we can undo it, backtrack just a little bit if we need to. Okay. So I'm gonna talk about adding that fourth signature again. So on our third signature, doing that last station, that last hole, okay, I'm going to take my tapestry needle and I'm inside my signature. I'm going to go from the inside to the outside. Okay. Pull that embroidery floss through. And I'm going to take the needle, and you can see, hopefully you can kind of see it a little bit here. There's a stitch. We have a stitch in between the second and first, and then there's a stitch between the first and the cover. And so to finish off my third signature, I'm going to take that tapestry needle and go under the stitch that's in between the second and first, okay, and pull that through. So you have that little loop here. And because we're on the end, we're varying this stitch just a little bit. And we're going to go back under that loop we just did. So can everyone see? I came out of that last station, that last hole. I looped it around row before, the embroidery floss from the row before. And then I'm going to go through that loop that I just made and pull that through. And that finishes the stitch there. So now, instead of going back in that last hole, I'm going to my next signature, right? Connecting the next one. So I'm just going to stick it in, that needle in. Sometimes it may take a minute. I know as I'm working on the pages, sometimes the pages get shuffled. One thing that helps, if you're experiencing that too, is to just kind of take a clip or a paper clip and hold it together. Sometimes that helps. I'm going to pull that embroidery floss through that first hole in my fourth signature. So we can see that's connecting here. So after we come in that first hole, we're going to go back out, but through that second hole. So we're coming through that second station. And because we're on our fourth signature, our fourth packet, we're going to go through the stitch that's in between the third and second. And so I'm just going to take my tapestry needle and go through that stitch. Right. So that's stitching those signatures together. Going through that embroidery stitch, under that embroidery stitch. And once we do, we'll go back through that same hole, the signature. I'm kind of pulling it somewhat tightly. So we're in that second station now. We're going to go to the third station and send that tapestry needle through. So we're going through that third station. And then again, because we're on that fourth signature, we're going to go under the stitch that is between the third and second signature. So I'm going to go underneath this stitch. and go back through that same hole in the 4th signature. Just building that book. Okay. So we're at the end of this one, this signature. We're going to go through that last hole from the inside to the outside. And then because we're on the 4th one again, we're going to go in between, we're going to go under the stitch, that embroidery stitch that's between the 3rd and 2nd signature. So I'm just going to go under that stitch till I get that little loop. We're on the end, so this is where that variation happens. Okay. We get that little loop, we're going to go through it and pull it tightly. And that's the end. That's our stitch. And then because we're at the end, we're not going to go back in that hole. We're going to combine or add, sorry, our last signature. Okay. So again, instead of going back through that 4th signature, we're going to go into the 5th signature. So I'm just going to take my tapestry needle and send it through. Well, I have a little shuffling that happened. And I'm going to send it through that first hole. So after we finish this last signature, that's how we're going to add that cover on. We're basically going to do a repeat of what we started with. Yeah. So going through that first one, we're in the inside, we'll go through that 2nd hole, that 2nd station. And then because we're on that 5th signature, we're going to go under the stitch from the 4th and 3rd. So we're gradually moving up. As we're adding signatures, we're going to that closest stitch, right? So I'm just going to stitch that through and then go back through that same hole. Moving to that 3rd station, going through the hole. And we're on that 5th signature. So we're going to go through the stitch, under the stitch that's between the 4th and 3rd one. So it's coming through like that. And going back through, again, going back through that same hole, that same station. I'm pulling it all the way through. So when we get to that last one, we'll kind of start it that same way. That 4th station, we'll go through, right, from the inside to the outside. We're going to loop around, right, go under that stitch between the 4th and 3rd. Go under that, pull that through. And you see we have that little loop there, the loop that's from that 5th station that's going under the stitch between the 4th and 3rd. Then I'm going to take my needle and just go through that loop that I just made. And instead of going inside this stitch in my 5th signature, that's where I'm going to add my cover. Right. I'm going to go from the inside of my cover to the outside. Everyone see that? So instead of adding another signature, I'm finishing it. Let me go back real quick. So instead of adding another signature, I've done the loop like I did, like I was going to like add another signature, but instead I'm going to add that cover. And because we're not going to, like, we're using like flat sheets for our cover, we're not doing like another signature going to the inside. We're just going to go from the top, like the inside of the cover to the outside of the cover. So we'll just kind of thread it through like this. And as I said, it's just a repeat of what we started with. So if you remember from last week, it feels like ages ago now, we're just going to loop around that cover. So we're doing that same stitch. Once you go through that first time, we're going to go back through it a second time, right? So we're making that, so we're making a little loop around that cover. Everyone see that's happening? So you want to make sure that it's pulled somewhat snugly, right? So after we do that loop, we have that loop on the cover, loop around the cover. Just like we did at the very beginning, we're going to go back through that signature. So we're going through that 5th signature. We're going through that first station, that hole. So I've looped it around the cover. So I'm going to go back through that hole on my 5th signature. And I'm going to pull it all the way through. So what's happening here is with all the insides of our signatures, you'll see that one single stitch, like there's 3, but it's like one layer, right, of those stitches in all our signatures. What's going to happen with our last signature is we're going to get kind of a double layer for each of those sections, right? So I'm coming through, attaching my cover to that 5th signature. I'm on the inside of my 5th signature. I'm going to go through that 2nd station. So I'm on the inside. So I'm going to go to that next hole and go from the inside to the outside of that signature. That 5th signature. Everyone see? Pulling that needle through that 2nd hole. And so then I'm going to go from the inside of the cover to the outside of the cover. We're on that 2nd station here, going from the inside to the outside. And then just like we did here with that first one, we're going to loop around and go through that hole the same way, same direction. So you go through that hole once in the cover, and then we're going to go back through that hole in the cover. So we've made another little loop on that cover. Yeah. So our embroidery floss is on the outside of our book. I'm going to take that tapestry needle and thread it through the hole in that 2nd station, right? Our 5th signature, that 2nd station. We're going to go back through that hole to get to the inside of that signature. So we did that 1st station, the 2nd station. Let's go to that 3rd one. We'll go through that hole in the signature all the way through. My thread got a little knotted. So I came through that hole in the last signature, right? Came through that 3rd station. And I'm going to do the same thing I did with those first 2. I'm going to go from the inside of the cover to the outside of the cover. Pull it tightly and do that same motion again, going through that same hole in the cover from the inside to the outside, right? Creating that loop. So now my embroidery floss is on the outside of my book. Back through that 5th signature, that last signature, go through that same hole. So I'm coming to the inside of my book. So then I'll move on to that last station, go through that hole, going all the way through to the other side of that signature. And then just like those others, I'm going to take my needle and go from the inside of that cover to the outside. Ooh. My thread came off my tapestry needle. Rethread that. So I thread my embroidery floss from the inside of my cover to the outside, pulling it tightly and going through that same motion, the same direction. So taking the needle and going from the inside of the cover to the outside of cover. It's making that loop that we have on the other stations, the other holes. Looping it. And then to finish this one, we're going to go back through the 5th signature's hole. The hole that we came from on the signature, that 5th one, back to the inside. Right? So we've made it to the inside of our book. So to finish this off, once we've gotten like everything stitched through, you can see those stitches, they're chained together, keeping all our signatures lined up. You can see like sometimes there's a little wonkiness to it. My holes don't quite line up, so my edges are not as flush. But the truth is, that's how you know it's homemade, right? It's handmade. It has character in there. So to finish it off, we're just going to knot this embroidery floss to our inside stitch. Okay. And so I'm just going to take my tapestry needle and do a couple knots, tying knotting it off, right, with our inside stitch. I'm going to do just 3 knots here. And knotting that off. And then just trimming that. And then I'm going to flip my book over to that first signature. And I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to knot it off. So I'll just take my tapestry needle here. Take the tail from our first signature. And just kind of knot it into that first stitch. And then trim that one. Now we have our little book, Coptic binding.